Thank you so much for that introduction. So I would like to also say thanks to all of the co-sponsors and everyone that was just mentioned in helping to organize this event. In particular, I've had several email correspondences with Melissa, Miranda, and Caitlin, so thanks to all of you for helping to work out the logistics. I also see a few people who were at the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers Conference, so it's wonderful to see you guys, 2 weeks later. And then I also see some Collegium Phenomenologicum people, so nice to see you guys too. So I'm going to go ahead and get in. This is not a very long lecture. It's about 16 pages, so it should be about 30 minutes. But here we have the room until 9 p.m., so if things get really interesting and we just want to plot a revolution or something, we can do that. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. I really appreciate this opportunity to share some mostly new material that I have not yet. Well, actually, that's not true. I just presented this as a version of this at SPEP a few weeks ago. So you're my second audience for this particular iteration of this. So it's mostly new material that I'm presenting out for a second time to a public audience. What I'm reading is not a single chapter, but rather threads and themes that I have been following to see where they will lead me. And this is for my current book project, which I'm trying to wrap up this year on critical intersectional analyses and engagements with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. And as I say this, I'm hearing in the back of my mind Erykah Badu singing a live performance of Tyrone. Now keep in mind that I'm an artist and I'm sensitive about my ish. Okay, but fortunately I'm a philosopher, which means that I'm accustomed to critical feedback, and I find that it helps me to better develop my arguments and expand my perspectives. So at this point, I've received some critical feedback on earlier iterations of the larger book project from numerous sources, two of which I want to respond to today. So the first is from Linda Martine Alcoff. It has been my great fortune to have Alcoff in the audience as I've presented different iterations of this project in multiple contexts. She and I tend to be or have been overlapping at several different conferences and events. So I would like to believe that the problems with analogizing different identities and experiences of oppression are self-evident, Alcoff rightly continues to push me on my critiques of analogy. So part of what's operating in this book project is a critique of Simone de Beauvoir's use of analogical reasoning, or comparing race and gender and women enslaved in The Second Sex. So Alcoff has rightly continued to push me on my critiques of analogies. She's urged me to read Lorenzo Simpson's The Unfinished Project, in which he stresses analogies as hermeneutical models for understanding across difference. And with her characteristic generosity, Alcoff also noted that Gail Polhouse Jr. also wrote a review of Simpson, which actually critiques his emphasis on analogies, which is helpful for me. The second source of critical feedback is from Stephanie Rivera-Barus, who has 2 published replies to my work on Beauvoir. And a commentary on a 2010 chapter I wrote on the race-gender analogy in The Second Sex, which is in that Convergence's Black Feminism and Continental Philosophy book. Barutz asserts, works like that of Gines are of utmost importance in opening a new theoretical terrain that considers the importance of Black feminist thought and its utility in thinking through race, gender, and sexuality within different philosophical traditions. Pierre Barutz also called for a more extensive examination of the disanalogy between race and gender in The Second Sex. However, in another commentary, Barutz rightly points out that in my 2014 article, Comparative and Competing Frameworks of Oppression, I mentioned the erasure of women of color in The Second Sex, but my examples of this erasure focus on erasures of Black women only. As I noted in my reply to her in Symposium on Gender, Race, and Philosophy, in the larger book project, I examined problematic engagements with and erasures of other women of color. So with the feedback from Alcoff in mind, I will revisit analogical approaches to difference in The Second Sex and explore arguments about the limits of analogical approaches. And with the feedback from Barutz in mind, I take seriously the "and other women of color" promissory note made earlier, today going beyond my own work on intersectionality and Black feminism to enter into conversations with Barutz, Norma Alarcon, Malini Jahaj Schuler, and Mariana Ortega. In addition to responding to this feedback, other themes that have emerged in this literature include critiques of subjectivity and white feminism in general, and in Beauvoir in particular, as well as the politics of citation and what Ortega describes as being lovingly, knowingly ignorant. So part 1, analogical approaches to difference in The Second Sex. So So in a 2010 essay, Sartre, Beauvoir, and the Race-Gender Analogy, A Case for Black Feminist Philosophy, I offered a preliminary examination of the race-gender analogy in Jean-Paul Sartre's Respectful Prostitute and Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, taking into account the influence of Richard Wright and Gunnar Myrdal on both Sartre's and Beauvoir's understanding of racial oppression as a white problem rather than a so-called Negro problem. I argued that the analogizing of racial oppression with gender oppression problematically codes race as black male and gender as white female, erasing the ways in which black women and women of color more generally experience racism and sexism, or racialized sexism and sexualized racism simultaneously. In that essay, I turned to Anna Julia Cooper's proto-intersectional black feminist philosophy as a counterexample to the more narrowly conceptualized single-axis oppression operating in these race-gender analogies. Later, in a 2014 article, Comparative and Competing Frameworks of Oppression in Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, I argued that a problem in this classic text is the way that she deploys comparative and competing frameworks of oppression. At times, she describes the woman, the black, the Jew, the colonized, and the proletariat in ways that suggest sexism on the one hand, and racism, anti-Semitism, colonialism, and classism on the other hand, are comparative systems of oppression. But when pointing to key differences between women and other groups, she sets up competing frameworks of oppression, privileging gender difference in ways that suggest women's subordination is a more significant or constitutive form of oppression than racism, anti-Semitism, colonialism, and or class oppression. Most recently, in my chapter, Simone de Beauvoir and the Race-Gender Analogy Revisited, which was just published in Nancy Bowers and Laura Hinchhold's Blackwell Companion to Beauvoir in 2017, it just came out, I expand my argument that Beauvoir's utilization of the race-gender analogy omits the experiences and oppressions of black women. I offer a more extensive examination of how the analogy is functioning in the text, while also providing a more nuanced exploration of the influences on Beauvoir. So that's kind of a recap of some of the work that I've done so far on this. So part 2, the limits of analogies when analogical approaches go wrong. That's a Dave Chappelle reference. So if it's not already obvious, one of the guiding arguments in these earlier essays that persist in the current book project is my contention that Beauvoir's analogical reasoning from the race-gender analogy to the slave-woman analogy to the gender suffrage analogy, and the ways, and this is dealing with her analysis of the suffrage movement and abolition movements in the United States in the second sex. The ways in which her comparisons between the gender oppression of white women, as if all of the women are white, and the racial oppression of black men, as if all of the blacks are men, ignores the multiple oppressions confronting black women and other women of color, those of us who are brave. I draw attention to the unarticulated specificity that is actually operating in the second sex, and the ways that this text's analogical approach and unspoken coding occlude analyses of the experiences and oppressions of women of color. So following Alcoff's prodding, I perused Lorenzo Simpson's The Unfinished Project, especially the sections on analogies as hermeneutical modes for understanding of cross-difference. I've also looked at Gail Poolhouse Jr.'s review of that text and found that I agree with the critiques of analogies offered therein. So for Simpson, analogy offers a common ground for understanding or a point of contact between worldviews that provides or expands tools for understanding one another's concerns in dialogue. For him, analogies can at least provide a starting point for developing this understanding. But for Poolhouse, analogies have the possibility of being helpful to understand differently socially situated others, but they are neither necessary nor sufficient. So Poolhouse asserts, while in some cases it can be helpful, it is not necessary to use analogies in order to understand another who does not share one's social position, culture, or worldview. And perhaps more importantly, it is never sufficient. Simpson argues that false analogies may stymie understanding, but proper analogies can expand understanding. To arrive at proper analogies, we might ask, what category of phenomena or what topics do we treat similarly or address in the way that they are addressing X? An example from Simpson also cited by Pohlhaus, is Peter Winch's observation that it is a mistake to see the Zandi magical rites as irrational technical practices, rather than as something more like the prayers of supplication that the West too takes seriously. For Simpson, such analogizing allows for the possibility of understanding not only another, but also the possibility of having a new way forward, but also the possibility of having a new understanding of myself. In contrast, for Pohlhaus, while we have to start somewhere, the way forward is not through analogy or by seeking to find similarities to ourselves and others. She notes, while I agree that in a certain sense we always begin where we are, I do not think this necessarily means we must make analogies to what we already know. That is, we must find in others similarities to ourselves in order to understand them and even ourselves anew. Pohlhaus turns to Trina Griot and Stephanie Wildman's essays, Obscuring the Importance of Race, to show how analogies often result in a false sense of understanding insofar as analogizers focus on themselves rather than really attempting to understand others. Analogizers assume the position of the one who suffers, or analogizers actually deny the existence of suffering of others. Thus, at the very least, such a reflection suggests that analogies are particularly likely to lead to a failure to understand when they are thought of as the crux of understanding. We might summarize these points by saying that while it might be possible to reach an understanding of differently situated others through analogies, it is also very probable that analogies will fail in several ways. Through a false understanding of others' experiences and suffering, through displacement of others' experiences and suffering, and or through a denial of others' experiences and suffering. Pohlhaus further emphasizes her cautions against analogies by turning to Kimberly Crenshaw's critique of white feminist analogizing of racism and sexism, including the slave woman analogy, which highlights the issues pertaining to the oppression of white women while making invisible the bulk of what African Americans suffered under slavery. Because the analogy began with the lives of white women, the range of things that could be seen using this analogy was set by the experiences of white women, so that the majority of what was suffered under slavery disappears in comparison. As Crenshaw notes, analogy in such a case result in at least two harms. First, it uses those to whom one is analogizing only to return to the origin of the analogy. Second, it makes invisible those aspects of that which one analogizes that are not present in the place analogized from. So here again we see the slave woman analogy. Crenshaw critiques the slave woman analogy as cited by Pohlhaus, her critique of it is the disappearing act that it creates. The analogy strategically exploits the suffering of the enslaved to advance the cause of white free women. It also renders invisible the suffering of the enslaved while bringing greater visibility to the experiences of white women. Just in case you're still holding out hope that the race-gender analogy or the woman-slave analogy is redeemable, let us consider these analogies from slightly different but still problematic angles. This takes us to the third question, or the third section, analogy and subjectivity. So according to Sabine Growick, in rereading Beauvoir After Race, Woman as Slave Revisited, the goal of the second sex is in part to establish a philosophical positioning of woman in the most universalizing and general sense, to counter the white patriarchal mythology of woman as lack, as absence, and at best an ornamental and empirical object. Despite Beauvoir's use of history and accounts of her own lived experience, Growick asserts that she actually turns away from these details in order to create a counter space for woman as a generalization, occupying a universal subject position that philosophy can recognize. And here this is white woman implicitly. So Growick argues that the woman as slave analogy, the logic of which has deeply racist effects, is one that has been used from early modern feminism, for example, in Wollstonecraft, through second wave feminism, for example, in Millet and in French feminists. She asserts the following, this is Growick. What appeared as a new philosophical prefiguration was actually a reconfiguration of an allegorical trope with a long history. the rhetorical construction that casts woman as slave in opposition to man as master has long allowed white Western women to enter critical negotiations of subjectivity in Western post-Enlightenment thought. She describes this geometrically as a triangle in which white man figures as subject, white woman figures as object, and black slave, a seemingly gender-neutral and invisible third position, figures as abject. So you have subject, object, and abject on the triangle. The significance of the triangle presented by Browick cannot be overstated. She describes it as the driving dynamic of transatlantic modernity. Taking seriously this triangle, it seems that feminist interventions by Beauvoir and others have not destroyed the subject-object binary, and the universal man as subject has not capitulated. Rather, woman has sought to gain more recognition, and again here implicitly white woman, has sought to gain more recognition from white man and tried to move closer to subjectivity by appropriating the suffering of the abject, that is, the enslaved blacks, while also avoiding being seen as abject herself. And the end, Browick notes, Beauvoir's analysis remained anchored in that binary philosophy, which does not have any critical interest in the thingification of the enslaved in modern enlightened history. Consequently, white women seeking subjectivity by appropriating and yet differentiating from black adjectivity ultimately miss opportunities for coalitions and solidarity with black women and men. Thus, the implications of the slave as woman analogy, like the other comparative and competing frameworks of operating throughout the second sex, warrant more critical attention. So Stephanie Rivera-Barrouz takes a similar critical stance toward Beauvoir in her recent article, At the Crossroads, Latina Identity in Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, where she argues that Latinas are rendered imperceptible in the second sex. This is true not only for Beauvoir's use of the race-gender analogy, which operates along a black-white binary in which race is coded as black men and gender as white women, but also throughout the entire text, which offers no considerations of Latina identity, experience, and oppression. As Barrouz points out, Beauvoir's use of the race-gender analogy functions to occlude the possibilities of articulating the multiplicitous character of identities. It presumes a separation between race and gender that cannot account for multiplicity, and it fails to provide a framework from which to explore the other who cleans houses, cooks, crosses borders, the other who is always multiple. As a corrective to Beauvoir's approach, Barrouz asserts that reflecting on what it means to be Latina in the U.S. context sheds light on some deeper-seated troubles with the comparative and competing structure of Beauvoir's framework for understanding the situation of woman and her oppression. For Barrouz, at stake in this discussion is whose oppression and lived experience can be named and identified as meaningful. Let us also take seriously here the earlier insights of Norma Alarcon and the theoretical subjects of this bridge called My Back and Anglo-American feminism. Juxtaposing the approach to subjectivity in this bridge called My Back, edited by Maranga and Anzaldúa in 1981, with the approach of Anglo-American feminism in general, and Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex in particular, Alarcon describes Bridge as a project that gives voice to the contradictory experiences of women of color, and in doing so, develops a theory of subjectivity in culture that would demonstrate the considerable differences between them and Anglo-American women, as well as between them and Anglo-European men and men of their own culture. In contrast, Alarcon notes, Simone de Beauvoir and her key work, The Second Sex, have been most influential in the development of white feminist standpoint epistemology. Beauvoir here, may even be responsible for the creation of Anglo-American feminist theory's episteme, a highly self-conscious, ruling class, white Western female subject locked in a struggle to death with man. So for Alarcon, it is problematic that the person in feminist theory is conceptualized as a self-sufficient individual, adult, and here she's drawing on blacks, and that the subject is constituted as individual and individualist. Here she's drawing on Spivak. The result is the construction of a feminist subject of consciousness that parodies masculine, and I would add masculinist, subject consciousness with ethnocentric liberal underpinnings. She elaborates, with gender as the central concept in feminist thinking, epistemology is flattened out in such a way that we lose sight of the complex and multiple ways in which the subject and object of possible experiences are constituted. The flattening effect is multiplied when one considers that gender is often solely related to white men. Alarcon pushes back on the inclinations and practices in Anglo-American feminism and women's studies more generally that construct and maintain a universal, unitary, or even common denominator category of woman that ignores, denies, downplays, flattens out, or silences complexities and difference. She explains the illusion of other analytical categories such as race and class becomes impossible for a subject whose consciousness refuses to acknowledge that one becomes a woman in ways that are much more complex than in simple opposition to men, insofar as one may also become woman in opposition to other women. Consequently, the freedom of women of color to posit themselves as multiple voice subjects is constantly in peril of repression precisely at the point where our constituted contradictions puts us at odds with women different from ourselves. Of course, there are resources in the writings of women of color to approach these issues differently. Alarcon is clear that Bridge, along with the 1980s writings by many women of color in the United States, has problematized many a version of Anglo-American feminism and has helped open the ways for alternative feminist discourses and theories. However, the impact among most Anglo-American theorists appears to be more cosmetic. And I'm going to pause here from the script just to make the public service announcement that I've been trying to make as much as possible when I speak publicly, which is that we stop citing without actually reading some of these texts that are coming from women of color from the 80s and the 90s, and stop pretending that we're somehow post the 80s and 90s. So there are plenty of dead white men and living white men who've published texts in the 80s and 90s that we continue to read as philosophers. So this idea that somehow women of color who've published texts in that time period, we're past that because it's 2017 is a problem. So we need to continue to read these texts, or read them in the first place and then continue to read them. Okay, back to the script. Okay, so we're talking about Alarcon here, explains, notwithstanding the power of Bridge to affect the personal lives of its readers, Bridge's challenge to the Anglo-American subject of feminism has yet to affect newer discourse. Anglo-feminist readers of Bridge tend to appropriate it, cite it as an instance of differences between women, and proceed to negate that difference by subsuming women of color into the unitary category of woman or women. Put another way, even if they are taught these texts, these texts are taught in courses and represented on reading lists, for example, in women's studies, there seems to be an inability among Anglo-American feminists to include the voices of women of color into feminist discourse. And here you can see also Mariana Ortega's Being Lovingly, Knowingly Ignorant, White Feminism and Women of Color, where she analyzes the notion of loving, knowing ignorance as a type of arrogant perception that produces ignorance about women of color in their work, at the same time that it proclaims to have both knowledge about and loving perception toward them. So these insights by Broek and Alarcon, along with Ortega, can be seen in Schuller's Analogy in White Feminist Theory, Rethinking Race and Color in the Cyborg Body, and this was published in 2005. So approaching these issues from the perspective of both post-colonial studies as well as gender and sexuality studies, Schuller describes incorporation by analogy as the dominant paradigm of the imperialist incorporation of women of color in contemporary gender and sexuality studies. Noting that post-colonial theory has already revealed how analogy and metaphor have been fundamental in constituting colonial discourse, and here she mentions Edward Said on woman as metaphor for the Orient, and binaries analogizing children and primitives. Schuller encourages readers to thoroughly investigate the role of racial analogy, resemblance, and metaphor within feminist and gender theory. On the one hand, she gently suggests that the analogizing move within white feminist theory, working through assimilation and the incorporation of racial difference, may constitute a neo-colonial moment more dangerous than the earlier absence of race, and thus may need close scrutiny. On the other hand, she also takes an even stronger position, asserting that racial analogy in white feminist gender sexuality studies functions as a colonial fetish, and here she has in mind Baba, that enables the white theorist to displace the potentially disruptive contradictions of racial difference onto safer and more palatable notion, a safer and more palatable notion of similarity, thus offering theory that can be easily assimilated within the politics of liberation. So building on Baba's notion of fetish, she adds, inclusion by analogy functions fetishistically to include the disturbing and troubling aspects of racial difference by mimicking the politics of liberal multiculturalism. And the final analysis, for Schuller, racial analogy within white feminist theory helps whiteness retain its privilege by being uninterrogated. So let us move at this point from the analogical approaches in Beauvoir and white and Anglo-American feminism to the intersectional, intermeshed, multiplicitous approaches and Mariana Ortega's scholarship. I will then conclude with what she describes as coalitional politics and the praxis of intersectional philosophy. So at this point, I'm almost to the bottom of page 12, so you only have 4 more pages to go. You guys are doing great. People actually looked up from their laptops when I said that. Okay, so section 4, intersectional, intermeshed, multiplicitous approaches. So I've previously presented on Mariana Ortega's article, Phenomenological Encuentros, Existential Phenomenology in Latin American and U.S. Latin Feminism, in which she details Latin American and U.S. Latina feminist engagements with existentialism and phenomenology through Beauvoir and Sartre, though not so much through Heidegger. Today, I want to take up her analysis of intersectionality and multiplicitous selves as an alternative approach to the aforementioned problematic analogical approaches to difference, as well as the subjectivity issues that have already been outlined. So Mariana Ortega's In Between, Latina Feminist Phenomenology, Multiplicity in the Self, which you guys also should read, offers an account of the multiplicitous self that is informed by intersectionality, women of color, including Black feminist and Latina feminist phenomenologies, and an explicitly ontological and existential analysis. She describes the multiplicitous self as another type of metizaje of multiplicity and oneness, world traveling, being in worlds, being between worlds, not being at ease, as well as its intersectionality, flexibility, decenteredness, and existential continuity. Today, I would like to highlight her emphasis on the import of intersectionality for the project of the multiplicitous self. She explains, I describe this self in light of the important notion of intersectionality introduced by women of color writers. Recognition of the multiplicity of the self requires an understanding of the complex ways in which the self's various social identities intersect or intermesh, recognizing the manner in which different axes of oppression are intertwined, and considering the self's flexibility. Taking into account some critical views of intersectionality, Ortega elaborates on her insistence in taking an intersectional approach. She asserts, it is my view that it is not necessary to have a closed description of the notion of intersectionality or the way in which it is applied methodologically for it to continue to be helpful in our understanding of the interactions between various social identities. She continues, thus, I continue to appeal to the notion of intersectionality, and as do Collins and others, I see it as a heuristic device. And she adds, intersecting axes of oppression shape both the individuals and groups and need to be analyzed if we are to attain a richer, more complex vision of experience. I appeal to the notion of intersectionality while being mindful that different axes of oppression cannot be assumed to be separable and that social identities are intermeshed. Coming back to the relationship between intersectionality and the multiplicitous self, Ortega elaborates, let us then understand the multiplicitous self as an embodied, situated self in process that is being between worlds and being in worlds, and that is characterized by intersectionality and flexibility. I don't have time to elaborate here, but I hope that you can see and hear the contrast between the aforementioned analogical approaches to difference as well as the critiques of a unitary subjectivity discussed earlier, and the alternative possibilities of intersectional, intermeshed, and multiplicitous selves. So Ortega goes on to offer possibilities for coalitional politics and proposes that we engage in what she calls a praxis of intersectional philosophy. Understanding the multiplicitous self provides context for both of these possibilities. She states, I propose that we understand the multiplicitous self as capable of having a coalitional politics that is attuned to multiplicity, difference, and the intersectional or intermeshed aspects between race, class, sexuality, gender, ability, nationality, and other categories. For Ortega, coalitional politics has three key elements. One is an understanding that coalitional politics is both a matter of being, belonging, as well as becoming, which includes location, being with, and becoming with, that lead to transformation. Two is an attunement to the intersectional or intermeshed aspects of our identities, or an understanding that the experience of multiplicitous selfhood is informed by the intersections of various axes of power. And three is a recognition not only of shared oppression, but resistant agency, which is dependent on what Lugonis theorized as complex communication that can lead to deep coalition. So to engage in the praxis of intersectional philosophy for Ortega is to practice philosophy in a way that is mindful both of how philosophical texts, traditional or contemporary, can be read in light of concerns related to race, class, gender, sexual orientation, physical ability, nationality, and so forth, and the ways these are intermeshed or inform one another in light of how philosophical texts intersect with texts from other disciplines. She elaborates, practicing intersectional philosophy would thus require us to read philosophical texts not merely to dissect them for the sake of knowing what Kant, Hegel, Arendt, Beauvoir, Fanon, and others said, but with both the diagnostic and constructionist projects in mind, with an attunement to how these texts can be connected to our current social world and how they can help us create new possibilities within our discipline and in the world in which we dwell. With this in mind, she makes the following call. Let us then keep practices of mestizaje and intersectionality as we engage in philosophical work. Intersectionality may be helpful not only in the way we approach philosophical texts, but also in how we view ourselves as philosophers. It is my intention in this current book project on women of color engagements with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex to be attuned to and respond to this clarion call by Ortega, shifting from analogy to intersectionality, and multiplicity. Thank you. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. And we have until 9 p.m. for questions. I was told some questions were planted in the audience. I see your hand. Actually, before I take your question, I'm going to let everybody stand up for a second and just kind of stretch and come back into you. Bring your mind back to your body for a minute. Yeah. I know, nobody's ever done that in a philosophy talk before. Yeah. I'm also a registered yoga teacher, so I believe that we need to attend to our bodies as well as to our minds. Okay, so take a couple deep breaths. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and start with your question. Tell me your name.
My name is Gregory Thomas.
Gregory, nice to meet you, Gregory.
Nice to meet you as well. My question is very simple. I just wanted to know what created your interest in finding, in viewing women of color in literature. Like what kind of created that interest?
Oh, in this particular book project?
Yes.
Well, so I'll tell you a longer story. This is more information than you're actually asking for, but I think it'll be interesting and pertinent for somebody in the room. So I did my dissertation on Sartre, Fanon, and Hannah Arendt. And so as I was kind of going through, after I finished graduate school and had different tenure track positions and was thinking through building my portfolio for tenure, I decided to separate out that project. So I extracted Hannah Arendt from the project and did the Hannah Arendt and the Negro Question book. And then my intention initially was to kind of return to Sartre and Fanon and do a second book project on that. And then Simone de Beauvoir kind of kept coming back up. So she's not someone that I was ever especially interested in as a philosophical figure early on. I mean, as an undergraduate student at Spelman College, I was very much immersed in Black feminist thought and Black womanist thought there. And even my white male philosophy professors at Spelman College, for example, taught people like Elizabeth Spelman, who was the white woman who was critiquing the kind of white feminist project. So as an undergraduate student, having read Elizabeth Spelman and then several other women of color critical engagements with the second sex, I wasn't that interested in the text. And then even in graduate school, any engagement I had with Beauvoir was usually connected to work I was doing with like Sartre and Fanon and other people. So I knew about like how she was participating in debates with like Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, for example, or her memoirs would tell, give different insights about things that were going on with Sartre and colonialism and Sartre and Fanon's relationship. So she was always kind of in the background, or I always just saw her through a more critical lens. And then, slowly but surely, I kind of became more interested in her, mostly critically. So I think everything that I've written on her up to this point has been critical, actually, as with Hannah Arendt. But at a certain point, you write so much, there's a sunken cost bias, right? So it was like, okay, I guess I'll go ahead and do a book on Simone de Beauvoir. I have declared this is the last book I'm writing on a white person. So yeah, you can snap. So I really want to read out. I want to put my intellectual and emotional energy into people of color scholars, because if we don't do that, who's going to do that kind of work? So what has kind of salvaged this project for me is the particular critical lens I'm taking, right? So what does it mean to read a book like The Second Sex, which has had so much impact on white feminism in the US and globally, and read it through the lens of women of color feminisms, right? So you have a lot of white feminists, especially white feminist philosophers, who've made it a scholarly project to make sure that Simone de Beauvoir is included in the philosophical canon and is recognized as a philosopher. And even among those white feminists who might be critical of Beauvoir and The Second Sex around issues of race, like a Sabine Browick or a Penny Deutscher, for example, even they don't cite the women of color scholarship on The Second Sex, right? So you have people like Lorraine Hansberry wrote a review of The Second Sex that is in Beverly Guy Sheftall's Words of Fire, which is a huge collection of writings by Black women in the U.S. that goes from like Maria Stewart in 1831 up until like the 80s, right? So everybody should get that book too. So Hansberry has a review of The Second Sex that's published in that anthology. Bell Hooks has written an essay called True Philosophers, Beauvoir and Bell, like as only Bell Hooks could title a paper, right? Angela Davis has engaged The Second Sex in her writings. Deborah King, Oyeronke Oyerumi. So there are very prominent Black women. Well, and then also Mariana Ortega, Stephanie Barutz, and Lugones, and other Latina feminists. So it's interesting to me that like even for white feminists who want to be critical of the racial dynamics that are happening in The Second Sex or the erasure of women of color in The Second Sex, they're still not actually citing women of color who've engaged that text. So that's been, that's a long answer to part of what's motivated me about the project, and what's kept me excited about it is what does it mean to read this text through these women of color scholarly lenses. And so you get a very different engagement with that text when you read it through that lens as opposed to a white feminist lens. So thanks for that question.
Yes. So thank you so much for your talk. Really great. It's very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
So my question was about this neo-colonial moment that you referred to when you were talking about the way that analogy works. And I was wondering, actually, if talking about it in those terms, where it's not linked to like material practices, is actually doing kind of like an erasure through metaphor rather than through analogy, with which you seem to be concerned in the first half of the paper.
So yeah, that is actually coming out of Alarcon's engagement with the text. And so I think what she's looking at is so she's looking at how on the one hand we can have a critique of white feminists for their lack of engagement or non-engagement with issues of colonialism, people of color, race, women of color, things like that. And so she's like, well, there's one critique. And then in response to that critique, you have white feminists who have done this kind of dutiful citation, and this is where I think Ortega is helpful, right? Where you have this dutiful citation of a text, but there's not actually any engagement with the text. So you have the ways that this manifests is these texts might appear on reading lists, they might appear in syllabi, they might be footnoted, but there's no evidence that the ideas and theories engaged by these or presented by these women of color are actually impacting the white feminists who are dutifully citing them. And so for Alarcon, this is what she's describing as this kind of neo-colonial moment, like there's this appropriation of these texts through this politics of citation, but not an actual engagement with the idea. So for her, if white women who were citing the text were actually critically engaging the ideas or integrating those ideas in any kind of meaningful way, they couldn't continue to produce the kind of publications and scholarships that they're producing. So I think it's an interesting question. I think for Alarcon, she wouldn't see it as another form of metaphor because that's precisely what she is critiquing. And I think she uses the language of neo-colonialism because she's also coming out of like a post-colonial studies context. But I think she would definitely not want to be analogizing or using a metaphor in what's going on there because that's precisely what she's critiquing in white feminism, or what she calls Anglo-American feminism.
So I guess I'm a little hesitant to ask this because it feels so classically post-structuralist of a question,
Okay.
but I'll
go for it.
selfishly asking it.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if the way that you see a really developed notion of enmeshment or intersectionality, if that presupposes semi-stable reference for identity. And so maybe if you could say a little bit about what notion of identity you're working with, because at one point you say axes of of oppression, which supposes like a historical dimension.
Mm-hmm.
At another level, you talk about power structures.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's always this assumption, especially with regard to race, that there's some biological or epidemiological aspect of race.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're talking about intersectionality or enmeshment in a way that aims to be more inclusive of these different identity markers,
Mm-hmm.
I guess maybe if you could say a little bit about identity that's operative,
Mm-hmm.
and how enmeshment or intersectionality can speak to a maybe more fluid or less stable notion of identity.
Okay, before I answer that, let me ask you, what's your, you prefaced it with your post-structuralist thing, so what's your post-structuralist soapbox?
Well, like, I've been reading, selfishly.
Yeah. That's okay.
Obviously
it's important to be selfish sometimes.
I know, but like at the Collegiate for Black Women Philosophers, right, you're like, don't talk about your dissertation at the beginning. So that's where that's coming from. So I've been thinking about, obviously, like applying Butler's theory of performativity to race, and thinking about passing and how Blackness is, or like development in mixed race studies around Blackness, and how, being mixed race in a predominantly white space, you code as, Black in a different way than you would if you're mixed race and you go visit like your Black families, family reunion, something like that. And so I'm thinking about passing and performativity and like fluid subjectivities.
Okay. Hold on, let me write that down. Okay, so I'm going to start by saying that when I was an undergrad at Spelman, I actually did my thesis on, I looked at Judith Butler's notion of performativity and applied it to race through Patricia Hill Collins' analysis of controlling images. So I was kind of bringing together Butler's analysis of gender performativity and seeing how does that cash out with a racial performativity when you think about controlling images and the ways in which Black women are seeking or practicing self-definition that we get in Patricia Hill Collins' Black feminist thought. And then as a case study for that, I looked at Elaine Brown, who at one point was the leader of Black Panther Party, in her book A Taste of Power, to see how, examples of that kind of gender and racial performativity. So I love this project that you've described. So I think for me, I'm not necessarily, I guess I am presupposing something stable, but not necessarily I guess depending on what you mean by stability, there is something that seems stable about these structures of oppression, the structures of these controlling images and how they've operated. But it's not a kind of stagnant or static stability, it's an ever evolving, right? So every time there's like a system of oppression that's there and there's some kind of resistance to that system of oppression, that oppressive system kind of regenerates or mutates itself to account for the resistance, and then there has to be more resistance, right? So it's stable insofar as there seems to be a kind of consistent, even if it's evolving and ever shifting systems of oppression to which people at certain intersections have to constantly, push back on or rebel against or fight against. So I think the things that you named, I would agree with. Certainly there are. So I tend to think about as identities as socially constructed, which is not to say they're not real, right? So there was a time, like when I was in graduate school, there was this whole thing like race is socially constructed, so it's not real, so get over it, right? So it's not that kind of social construction. It's a social construction that does still have kind of real world, concrete, material consequences and issues. So you mentioned historical, certainly we would have to take into account history. And I think history is important. Philosophers are notoriously bad historians, right? We make stuff up. And so, I was trained slightly differently insofar as I was trained to look at the historical evolution of certain concepts. I mean, and I guess if you're doing a genealogical account, you might be more inclined to do that. But not all philosophers do that. A lot of times we just kind of make things up in a vacuum. So it is important to pay attention to the historical context. Power dynamics, certainly we also need to pay attention to, because these identities are shaped, and then the ways of resisting and pushing back are all, power relations. The biological aspect of it, I tend not to focus on the biological, but I think it's important to, again, going back to the history, understand histories of scientific racism and things like that. My next book project is on race and Buddhism, and one of the things I'm looking at with that project is the UNESCO statement around UNESCO statements around race, and there seems to be focus on the scientific response by UNESCO on race without attention to the more philosophical response. So you have people like Robert Bernasconi or Lewis Gordon who emphasize the UNESCO statements on race from that scientific perspective, and critiqued it to say, well, race is not just about science, it's also about, culture and conscience and all of these other things. But UNESCO actually also had several publications that dealt with that, one of which was called Buddhism and Race Question. And so, that's one of the directions I'm going with post this Beauvoir project with that. So I think the project of passing performativity and fluid subjectivities is important, and I think it does fit in well with a notion of, even though I think there's some, so Lugonis later, even though earlier she uses the language of intersectionality, later she critiques and pushes back on it a lot more. So I think for somebody like Lugonis, even though for me intersectionality and intermeshedness and multiplicity can play well together, so to speak. For someone like Lugonis, she may be more explicitly rejecting intersectionality and saying no, we need to use the language of intermeshedness. Whereas Ortega, I think I'm more in line with Ortega, where she's these terms and concepts are compatible with one another. So does that help? You want to come back?
Yeah.
Hello.
My question, I think, follows up on the earlier question about neocolonialism. Because in that part of your talk, you talked about teaching texts and the way that if we taught texts about or from these very these Black women and Latino women, that there's a concern that we could be producing further ignorance about them at the same moment when teaching them. So I was wondering if you could say more about how we can be attentive as to do intersectional philosophy with these very texts we want to introduce in our syllabus in our classrooms. Because I look at this room and at least half of us are there's professors of philosophy, future professors of philosophy, and also philosophy students who will read some of these texts in our courses. So if you could speak to.
Yeah, so I think here, and again, this is coming out of Alarcon, and then I put Alarcon with Mariana Ortega here. But I think the idea is not so much, so the argument certainly isn't don't teach women of color in your courses, right, and don't include them in the text. I think the argument is slightly different, which is to say it's one thing to put a text on a syllabus. It's one thing to put a book on a reading list. It's another thing to have those books as integral to your comps reading list, for example, or your dissertation bibliography, for example, or the people that you're citing and actually engaging their theories in your publications, right? And so I think what Alarcon is trying to get at is this kind of tokenism that happens when you put women of color in the classroom syllabus or on the, you know, the private reading groups, but they're not actually being actively engaged in the scholarship that goes out. So the scholarship then just continues to duplicate the citation of dead white men or continue to engage the questions that have been raised by dead white men as opposed to the interventions that have happened by women of color in those very questions, right? So when you're actually engaging theoretically engaging, and also beyond theory, because a lot of these women were not just theorists, they were activists, right? So when you're actually actively engaging both the theories and the praxis of these women of color, then you're going to ask very different questions and come up with very different answers instead of the same old, like, how do you know you're not a brain in the back question, right? Like, how do you still ask that question in 2017? Or what's the relevance of that question in 2017, right? Unless you're doing some old, like, Octavia Butler or sci-fi type stuff, which would be a really interesting, you know, different take on the brain in the back question, right? But you're just going to end up with very different questions and ways of engaging those questions, right? So the idea isn't white people shouldn't teach women of color or read women of color. It's just like, how do you get beyond that symbolic tokenism of doing that and do something richer and deeper? And how does that shift the publications? And how does that shift the conference presentations? And how does that shift the dissertations and the books and the articles that get published? Yeah. I mean, what's fascinating to me is that, you know, that I am in 2017 doing a project like this. Like, the reason why this project is still necessary is precisely because white feminists still have not taken up things that have been brought up at least since 1831 by Maria Stewart. So it's like, okay, how many centuries of women of color scholarship have to be produced before there's that epistemic uptake where the questions are actually engaged and you're not asking the same questions or still caught in this kind of binary that's been described here.
And when we're discovering women philosophers in the canon, it's not equal.
Exactly, because the woman is always white, right? Exactly. Oh, that was another reference which I didn't make explicit, but the book, some of the, all of the women are white, all of the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. Is another book that everybody should read, along with This Bridge Called Back and Words of Fire and many, many others. Okay, I'm seeing a couple of questions now. Okay, you want to go a little bit later. Okay, so I'm gonna go here and then I'll go over there.
Thank you so much. I just want to hear more about like a general topic because you were kind of touching on it in your answer to the last question.
Okay.
But I'm just curious about the way that this intersectional, multiplicitous approach has a different relationship to activism. Like, it seems like it's a different type of practice that. And you were saying a little bit about it in the answer to the last question, but I wonder if you could say maybe just like a little bit more. Like, how does it change what we're doing if we want to be like activists?
So I think it shifts some of the questions that get asked in activism, and then, you know, let's see, how would I put this? So part of where a book like Some of Us Are Brave or This Bridge Called My Back is coming out of a context, or even the notion of intersectionality, which again I argue goes back to Maria Stewart in 1831. But when you look at the coining of the term by Kimberly Crenshaw, it's in the context of legal theory and this idea that, okay, there are laws that cover race, but you have to be a black male in order to be kind of addressed by those laws, and there are laws that cover issues of gender, but you have to be a white female in order for your issues to be addressed. And so you have people of color who are falling through the legal cracks of that, right? And so when you think about that in an activist context, how do you create an activist project or platform that doesn't allow for those leakages and those cracks for people to fall through, right? So you have, I mean, and actually Beauvoir is another good example of this. Like, there's an interview that she does later in life where this isn't a specific, well, I guess it is, so it's both a scholarly and activist question. So there's an interview with her later, before she dies, but many years, like decades after The Second Sex is published, where on the one hand she acknowledges, if someone were to do a book like The Second Sex again, it would have to be this more, she doesn't use the language of coalitional, but it would have to be a more coalitional project where you actually engage differently situated women to ask questions around. So there's not just this universal woman, so she kind of recognizes the limitations of her analysis in The Second Sex in the interview. But then she completely undermines that by going on to critique black women in the United States for not listening to white women around the question of patriarchy. Right? And so if you're thinking like white women had the patriarchy thing figured out, and if women of color would just stop standing by their men, then they would get it, then you're kind of missing a whole lot of what's going on, because for the women of color, they're saying, okay, yeah, we might be dealing with intragroup patriarchy, among men of color, but we're also dealing with intragroup racism with white women, right? And so if you can't see across those various points of situatedness, then I think an activism project is going to be, limited and very narrow and myopic. Yes.
So thank you. And maybe picking up on a couple of questions, just the last two questions. So I want to ask maybe an inverse question from the one that you just posed about ways to teach a bit of color on syllabi. What would you say it means to teach the Beauvoir on a syllabus today?
Yeah.
So, I guess, what value do you think there is in something teaching on something like this intersects? Is there merely a historical interest insofar as it had, let's say, impact on discussions of feminism sort of more broadly, or white feminism more broadly? So is it merely, let's say, historical interest that we should sort of have as something which is a touchstone that we need to know that history, or is there something of value in terms of an idea, perhaps, that might be still relevant or still important for what you want to sort of argue?
Okay. So I'm not someone who thinks because a particular philosophical figure is racist or sexist or heterosexist or ableist that they shouldn't be read, right? Because if that was the case, we wouldn't really have much of a canon, right? Or at least, the dead white men in the canon. Depending on how your canon is constructed, you wouldn't have a canon left, right? So my argument is not, there are these shortcomings or these limits within these figures in their text, therefore they should not be read. I think the more productive project is, what does it mean, instead of kind of assuming that these problematics in the text are in the margins or somehow can be separated from the core theories or arguments from the text, what does it mean to actually make those problematics central to the text, right? What does it mean to read the text through the lens of the problematics that it raises? And I think we get different, again, very different questions get asked, and we can have a much richer kind of engagement with the different philosophical figures that we're talking about, right? And so I think that's across the board. I mean, that's in part what I'm doing with the Hannah Arendt book, right? So for a lot of people, Hannah Arendt is like the one philosophical figure who kind of escaped all of these critiques, right? She's about pluralism and inclusivity and all of this kind of stuff. And yeah, there was that Little Rock essay, but if we pretended the Little Rock essay didn't exist, then the rest of her corpus still stands, right? And so part of my project in that book was to say, okay, the theoretical framework that's operating in Reflections on Little Rock is the same framework. It's consistent across her writings, right? So I kind of extract out in the first 3 chapters of the book what's the theoretical framework in Reflections on Little Rock, and demonstrate how it's consistent across the rest of the writings, from Origins of Totalitarianism to the Human Condition to On Revolution to On Violence, etc., right? And so, but when you take that seriously, at the end of the day, it's not don't read Hannah Arendt, it's, well, how can we, what is still kind of valuable or useful in that theory when we take seriously these other questions and problematics, right? And so I would say that for any of these philosophical figures, I think a lot of them have different tools that we can offer. I think it's getting away from like I've heard Christy Dotson describe this as like hero worship, right? So it's getting away from assuming that these philosophical figures are somehow godheads that should never be questioned, and or that our only duty in life is to kind of duplicate whatever question or finish their unfinished projects, and rather looking at them as offering some tools that may be helpful for actually disrupting the system, right? So we were just at the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers 10-year anniversary conference, and Angela Davis was one of the keynote speakers, and she was amazing and awesome, of course. But one of the things that she emphasized in her keynote was she was talking about jazz and making comparisons between Black women and jazz and the erasures of Black women and jazz and Black women in philosophy and similar erasures. And she talked about the rules that happen in jazz and the kind of philosophical systems that get created in philosophy. And one of the things she emphasizes is that the reason why you learn the rules of jazz is to learn how to break the rules of jazz. The reason why you learn philosophical systems is to learn how to transcend and go beyond those philosophical systems. So I think where a lot of philosophy students and faculty get stuck is that they learn the philosophical system and then they become ensnared and entrapped in those systems instead of trying to move beyond them, right? So what I'm proposing is we may continue to read the philosophical canon, a more narrowly constructed one, or I would advocate for a much more broadly inclusive constructed canon, but not so that we're stuck within the canon, but so that we can transcend the canon, so that we can ask different types of questions and see the ways in which these questions, what these questions may have missed in the past, and how we cannot continue to duplicate. I mean, I think that's what's kind of absurd about philosophy, is like not just that the same questions that or it is that the same questions just continue to get asked over and over again. Like there's this interesting kind of problematic, like everybody's always feeding on the previous thing. I mean, or even just the whole mythological construction of philosophy is starting with like the pre-Socratics and Greece, and then leading up to Germany, and then nobody else is included. Or the idea that Heidegger, is the only person who ever thought about being as a question for beings. Like, do you really think like only one person in Germany in the history of life ever had a question about like being an ontology? So the fact that we entertain the mental gymnastics that allows for those epistemologies of ignorance is problematic. So we read the text not to maintain those epistemologies of ignorance, but to kind of call them out and move beyond them. So I know you had your hand up, and then there were hands over here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this. This is just amazing. So I'm thinking, like, when you were talking about the second sex, I was attempting to establish a different and then during the Q&A, the previous question, this idea that of what women integrate a lot of people are not just taking their lead, right? The limitation of that patriarchy. And I'm sitting here thinking, Rose McGowan. And especially because like Rose McGowan's interaction with David Duvernay, if anyone's watching Rose McGowan. Oh yeah, sorry. Rose McGowan called for a women's boycott of Twitter, right? And it seemed kind of this universal standpoint of women, and David Duvernay kind of pointed out that the white women tend to come together and call for a universal coalition of women when there's some kind of harm done to white women, when they're very silent when there's harm done to black women, women of color. And Rose McGowan's response on Facebook, which is now been taken down, was to say that she was disappointed in Ava DuVernay because she was causing fissures in the community of women, right? And that she wasn't standing by women, and this was supposed to be a universal women movement that included all women. And yeah, I guess, I don't know if I have a really specific question, but I was just curious if you saw any, or if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's a great, contemporary case study of that. I mean, I think you could also look at the Women's March on Washington and what happened with that. I mean, originally they kind of, pivoted and shifted gears, but it is this idea that, okay, when we say women, we mean white, like by the default position of woman is white woman, and then the afterthought are women who don't fit into that. And then when you as a woman of color say, well, this is not representative, then you're the person who's being, causing fissures or causing divisions and things like that. This is a classic move that, literally goes back, centuries. So, but again, but also the pathology of it is that it literally goes back for centuries, right? And this within philosophy, but it also, women's gender sexuality studies has made some progress, more progress than philosophy has on this, but there are still some issues there as well. So yeah, the struggle continues, as they say. I think I saw a hand over here, and then I'll come back to you.
Hi, I have a kind of specific question about enmeshedness, because I'm interested in that language because I'm interested in a kind of materialist account of the object position that you mentioned in your talk, which was so great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I guess for me, I'm interested in when accounts that disarticulate rather than create analogies between different axes of oppression, when the object-subject position nonetheless falls out there. So for example, Fanon distinguishes between the oppression of anti-Semitism and anti-blackness, and he says the Jew is attacked for his race, but the black man, in his language, is attacked in his body. And I think that is a really important phenomenological distinction, but what drops out is the account of the specificity of the possibility of black Jewish oppression, and
not to mention women.
Not to mention women, and so I work on embodiment and affect and transgender studies, Jewish studies, and to a certain extent critical race studies, and I'm interested in what kind of materialist account of this object position can be given, because so for example, and how can we do that without creating analogies? How can we talk about, for example, the experience of Black transgender women who, you know, are such targets of violence and just intense oppression right now. How can we maintain the specificity of that while talking about things like trans-misogyny writ large or anti-Blackness writ large? How can we have an account of trans-misogyny more, the oppression of Black trans women, while maintaining, for example, like observing the commonalities that are not necessarily analogous, but do. I'm thinking of Fred Moten's account of Blackness as pathology or as monstrosity, and that next to Sandy Stone and Susan Stryker's account of trans womanhood as pathology, monstrosity, and how do those come together in a way that is not just, okay, we have an account of anti-Blackness and we have an account of trans misogyny, and now we're adding them together, you know, to get this you know, additive function. How can we see the ways that they compound each other and actually work together?
So I think, again, this goes back to like who is being read and who isn't being read, right? So you can look at analyses of anti-Black racism, and I have very similar, not similar, but you know, for differently situated critiques of critical philosophies of race by Black men that have all kinds of problematics around gender questions, right? So, you know, I remember one year at SPEP, I was given one paper where I'm like calling out the white women for their intra-group racial politics, and I'm calling out Black men and other men of color for their intra-group gender politics, right? Because it's happening on all, you know, but this is precisely what like the Intersectional Intermesh Women of Color project has been, you know, questioning and engaging for a long time. So I think when you think about, you know, if your source is something like the Combahee River Collective, then you're not faced with the same dilemma as bringing together something that only focuses on anti-Black racism but doesn't pay attention to gender and sexuality, or something that focuses on gender and sexuality and transsexuality but doesn't pay attention to race, right? So there are ways in which, you know, we can do critical projects that pulls tools from these different sources, right? And I think that is a worthwhile project, but it's also important to recognize that there are actually sources out there that always already are putting these things together, because for those of us who are actually situated in that way, it's never a question of picking or choosing one or the other, right? You're always entangled in, you know, in certain kinds of questions. So part of it is like, you know, who's being read to answer those kinds of questions. But I think part of it is also like, so I was thinking also when you first started talking about intermeshedness, so for someone like Lugones who's using this language, she really wants to emphasize this idea that none of these identities are distinct. You know, they're always already, you know, interconnected. And so, which is why she used, I think part of what she wants to get at with intermesh that is not for her in intersectionality is she really wants to push back on this idea that any of these identities are separable from one another. They're always curdled together with one another for her. And so, but that's messy and tricky and hard, right? It's much easier. And I think this is also a philosophy thing. We always want to have these like neat taxonomies and categories, and we can see like how categories overlap, but the idea that the whole system, you know, the taxonomies are again socially constructed, right? And so part of it is how do we unlearn the ways in which we've been trained philosophically to think in separate categories and allow for just the messiness that is the lived experience of people, because there are Black, gay, Jews, or Black, trans, you know, whomever. Like there are people who always already exist at these various what I would call intersections or intermeshed identities. And so for those of us who already exist at those intersections or intermeshed identities, how do we, well, again, where's the epistemic uptake of the work that's already been done in that area, as opposed to pulling, you know, I mean, not necessarily as opposed, but maybe in addition to pulling from different sources and different approaches to it. What does it mean to actually read people who are writing from that standpoint already? Yeah. And also I think maybe in addition to the materialist account, we do need more, I mean, this is where phenomenology and existentialism I think are very helpful to really talk through the, you know, the phenomena of that lived experience, or write through it or think through it. Hope that helps. Yes.
So just kind of piggybacking on this question, so does commonality in like naming specific oppression fall out completely for you? Or is it a task of naming commonality and just staying attuned to the fact that there's always going to be difference remainder that needs to be accounted for.
So I think what I'm suspicious of, what's happened actually is I think I was much more, I've gotten more radical on this over time, precisely because white women end up just pushing you and where you're just like, forget it, like, no, you can't do any analogy at all. So I think I started at a much more midway position, and I've gotten more extreme on it precisely because it's like, again, you're not heard unless you like push it, push it out farther. So I'm not arguing against any commonalities at all. I think what my main concern is not only the collapsing of different systems of oppression, right? And here I'm thinking about, like, again, you have the race-gender analogy that I've talked about, the woman-slave analogy that's operating perpetually. I've been critical of McWhorter's work, where the collapsing of gender oppression or homophobia into a form of racism, right? In a way that, again, doesn't account. So there's this comparison between anti-black racism and heterosexism, but the comparison or that analogy operates in a way that completely erases people who are people of color who experience both anti-black racism and homophobia, right? So when your project is erasing the people who are at the very intersections of the systems that you're comparing to one another, I think that's when you kind of know something's gone wrong there. And so how do we pay closer attention to this assumption that these are neatly separable categories and that there aren't people who actually exist at the intersections of those categories? So that's not some of my concerns. So part of it is the collapsing of different systems of oppression as if they're one and the same, in a way that people again fall through the cracks. But another issue is, and this is something I think Browick names very brilliantly, is the actual strategic exploitation of a group of one group's oppression for the purpose of pushing forward your agenda when you're not interested at all in their experience of oppression, right? And so you might think about like the Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter kind of thing, right? So if somebody's making the case for the Blue Lives Matter or the All Lives Matter, it's not that they're interested in building a coalition with Black Lives Matter. It's because they know there's been a certain kind of uptake with Black Lives Matter, and they want to exploit that uptake to further their own cause, often to the degradation of the very cause that they're appropriating, whose suffering they're appropriating. And I think that's something that Browick gets at that I'm very sympathetic with and really want to push. So it's, some people have pushed me more on the analogy thing, and so I'm not necessarily anti-analogy as such. It really is, what happens with the collapsing, paying attention to the collapsing that happens with analogizing, but also paying attention to the exploitation of the suffering of one group, so that you can put your own group out ahead and still not pay attention to that suffering that you strategically deployed to, bring yourself into the limelight again. So I think that subject-object triangle gets at that. Yes.
You mentioned in one of your responses that like white feminists, like when we talk about women, your natural response is like white women, and that black women are the afterthought. And you kind of mentioned some of the things that white feminists and white philosophers can do to kind of like change that narrative. What can men or African men do to maybe you touched on it, I overlooked it. What can men, or in particular African men, do to kind of help change the narrative as well?
Mm-hmm. So I would say I don't think it's a natural response. I think it's a socialized, conditioned response to assume that the category of woman is white woman, right? I mean, that is, done in all kinds of ways, from the books that we read to the television that we watch to media and ads and all kinds of other things, to social conditioning and how we're raised in families. So I think there are a number of different things that contribute to the assumption that when one says woman, it's a white woman, and it's only the woman. Well, that's the other thing. I mean, this is a philosophy thing too. We speak in universals when we mean particulars, right? So when philosophy says man, it's not an all-inclusive man, it's a white man, right? When philosophy says woman, it's not an all-inclusive woman, it's a white woman, right? But we pretend that there are these universal categories, and then somehow it's the people who take the time to actually give specificity to whatever category, that it's somehow we who are being, divisive or fracturing communities and things like that. And it's like, well, no, we just actually, we acknowledge the specificity of our position, whereas you assume you're in this universal position, right? So anyway, that's a separate thing, but that undergirds part of what you're saying. So in terms of what men can do, I think there are similar projects that need to happen on both sides. Like, what does it mean to seriously engage with the scholarship, whether you're a white feminist or a black male race theorist? What does it mean to critically engage women of color scholarship around these issues, right? Because it's not the case that only black male philosophers have ever written on race any more than it's the case that only white women have ever written on gender, right? And so and this again goes back centuries, right? So going back to like a W.E.B. Du Bois or Frederick Douglass. So I've written critiques of even somebody like Du Bois and Douglass, who are pretty pro-feminist, generally speaking, still have really problematic erasures and under engagements with their contemporaries, right? So Du Bois, for example, appropriates a lot of the theory and arguments from Anna Julia Cooper without actually citing Cooper, right? So there's one point where he says, like, as one of our women states, and quotes Cooper, but does not say it's Anna Julia Cooper, right? She's just one of our women, right? So there's that patriarchal possession that's happening in Du Bois with Cooper without really properly citing that she's a source. Or even with the founding of the NAACP, Ida B. Wells was one of the founding members of the NAACP, but he leaves her off the rolls as a founding member of that organization, right? So that kind of problematic interracial gender politics has been happening in the US for a long time. In terms of contemporary black male race theorists, the closest person I found, well, I don't know, Lewis Gordon does engage Cooper's work in a couple of his different writings. Somebody like George Yancey has certainly in his anthologies and things like that been more inclusive of women and women of color in particular in those anthologies. But Charles Mills, I think, probably does one of the best jobs. And then I just still wrote a critique on this article, or on this chapter. So he and Carol Pateman wrote a book together called Contract and Domination. So Carol Pateman had done the gender contract book, and then Charles Mills did the racial contract book. And then they co-authored a book together called Gender and Domination. And so Charles Mills has a chapter in that book on intersecting contracts, where he very richly engages a lot of the women of color literature, and black feminist literature in particular, around the problem of, intersecting identities and the idea that, white women leave black women out, and white feminists leave black women out, and black male race theorists leave black women out. But having done all of that, he still claims like 4 or 5 times in an article that race trumps gender. So I'm like, Charles, how do you read all of this rich literature that insists that that one category can't trump the other and still claim that race trumps gender? So on the one hand, that's one of the best examples that I could point to of actually engaging in the arguments of like really going through. He gives really nuanced accounts of what's happening in black feminist scholarship. And yet, despite that, there's an epistemology of ignorance even there, where he wants to go on and claim that race trumps gender. So that piece, if you're interested in it, is in, and I'm sure I give other examples in there, but it's in the Critical Philosophy of Race journal. I think it came out last year, maybe the end of 2016. So I have that critique, and Charles responds to my critique in there. So that might be something worth looking at. But yeah, so just actually read and cite and engage the questions that are out there. I mean, another thing that happens, which is very frustrating, is this idea that, the actual practice of various people who suddenly have an idea about something and think they're the only person who ever thought about that, right? So somebody who suddenly becomes interested in questions around race or colonialism or whatever the case may be, and they think like they're the first person who's ever thought about that, as if there's not a whole body of literature that's been written on these questions, right? And the double standard that happens with regard to people of color scholarship, right? So for example, let's talk about Collegium Phenomenologicum, right? I heard about this conference when I was an undergraduate student. It's part of why I became a philosopher. I had a philosophy professor who was like going to this conference in Italy every summer, and I thought, if that's what it means to be a philosopher, is to go to Italy for 3 weeks in the summer and do philosophy, sign me up all day long. So this was one of my, aside from the fact that when I was an undergrad, there were only 16 black women in the country with a PhD in philosophy. So the larger motivation was increasing our representation, but a secondary motivation was doing philosophy in Italy. So I go to graduate school, and one of my first orders of business with the faculty there was like, I know there's this conference in Italy. What do I have to do to go to the conference? So after the summer after my first year in grad school, the conference was on Heidegger's Beiträge. His contributions to philosophy lectures had just been translated. And so I was told, okay, well, if you want to, so I couldn't just say like, I want to go to Italy, sign me up to read the Beiträge in Italy, right? This was you had to go through a certain rites of passage to go to this conference, right? So the response was, okay, well, the conference is on the it was 3 weeks only on the Beiträge. But before you get to the Beiträge, you have to read through Sein und Zeit, right, being in time. So I spent the fall semester, in addition to my coursework, in addition to my other responsibilities as a first-year graduate student, we spent the fall semester going through Sein und Zeit, where every other word is being, right? And it was just like, whatever. If this is what I have to do to go to Italy, I'll read a book full of beings all day long. So we read Sein und Zeit in the fall semester. And then the spring semester, we read the Beiträge, right? So I say that to say, like, I couldn't just show up to a conference on Heidegger saying, like, oh, Heidegger sounds interesting, right? There's this assumption, and then you're expected to read it, like, not only in English, but also the original German, and you're going through all the mistranslations that happen, and if somebody says a new beginning, then you know they don't know what they're talking about, because Heidegger doesn't say a new beginning, he says another beginning, right? There's all these nuances and tech, you know, whatever. Whereas, like, when it comes to people of color, it's just, and then actually, interestingly, at this very conference, where everybody thinks they're Heidegger or German or whatever. It was a weird, anyway, but it was in Italy, so it was awesome. And I've gone back to the conference. Obviously, I have some fond memories of it because I named Collegium of Black Women Philosophers is inspired in part by the title of that conference. But when we were at that conference, it was me and a friend of mine, Annika Simpson. We were in the same cohort in graduate school together. So this white woman comes up to us and says, only to us, you know, because we're the black people there, so she feels like she's obligated to tell the black people this, that she read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and it changed her life. And now she's teaching African American philosophy and race philosophy, right? So you can, like, read one novel and declare yourself a specialist in Africana philosophy or critical philosophy of race, but I have to read, like, the German original and the English translation of Sein und Zeit and the Beiträge in order to just show up for a conference on Heidegger, right? So what's wrong with that picture, right? So the assumed specialization and rigor and training that has to go into one type of philosophy, and the assumed, like, wistfulness, just pick it up and roll with it, that goes with other types of philosophy is problematic. Okay, that I feel like I went on a little bit of a tangent there, but all of that needed to be said. Any other questions? We'll go here first and then I'll.
Yeah, I'm sort of interested in the build to ignorance that you sort of alluded to during your talk. Mm-hmm. And if you could say more about Beauvoir's position towards it, and then also Arendt's, and how those two figures sort of circle around that mindset. Because Arendt seems a little bit more insidious.
Well, I mean, I think they both can be insidious in different ways. So I think there are different ways of thinking about this. One, you know, Charles, of course, this notion of epistemologies of ignorance is very helpful and fruitful, I think. I think they may manifest in slightly different ways. I mean, I think, interestingly enough, Beauvoir is actually more engaged, like, has more black intellectual interlocutors than Arendt does, right? And so with Beauvoir, part of the issue, and Penny Deutscher gets at this in her book on Beauvoir, like, she actually had access to more resources than are reflected in the analysis that she provides in the second sex and other contexts, right? Because she comes to, like, America Day by Day is about her coming to the United States, where she spends a significant amount of time. I mean, and that text is problematic for different reasons. But she spends a significant amount of time with, like, Richard Wright, she's and Ellen Wright, so she's actively engaged in conversations with people like Richard Wright, and then she and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty in Latent Moderne published several of, you know, they translate and publish several of Richard Wright's writings, and also writings from the Negritude and other kinds of things. So the interesting thing about Sartre and Beauvoir is, like, on the one hand, they're helpful double agents because they are actually engaging with some of the activists and scholars that are coming out of, like, anti-colonialism and the Negritude movement and issues of anti-black racism in the United States. On the other hand, despite those interactions, they still have these kind of problematic representations of what's going on. So, I mean, I guess it says something about the persistence of epistemologies of ignorance, or just that, you know, the ways in which the perniciousness of just white supremacy, where even when you're engaging, I mean, and even where Sartre will actively say, you know, you should, you know, this person can say this better than I can, you still see things kind of crop up and pop up in his writings as well. So I think part of the issue with Beauvoir is, on the one hand, she's actively talking to, and Fanon for that matter as well, she talks about how he was constantly calling she and Sartre out for, like, not doing enough around issues of colonialism. And yet those engagements somehow still don't are not adequately reflected. I mean, they're somewhat reflected, but not fully reflected in, you know, in their scholarly writings. So that's like the Beauvoir case. Then I think on the Arendt side, so, you know, and I talk about this in the Arendt and the Negro Question book, where she gets into it with Ralph Ellison, for example, who calls her out, or even her very paternalistic response to James Baldwin, for example, right? So there's an awareness. I mean, so I've described Arendt as having simultaneously this insight that can be very helpful for analyzing certain systems of oppression, but it exists side by side with this oversight of her own, you know, how as much as she wants to critique the Western philosophical tradition, she remains entangled in that tradition, you know, even trying to escape it. And so there are just these really problematic kind of claims that get made not only around race and racism in the US context, but colonialism in Africa and, you know, all of these other kinds of things. And so in her case, she doesn't necessarily have the same kind of friendships and companionships that Beauvoir has with scholars of color, but she still, you know, they all have resources at their disposal where they should know better and could do better, and they don't, you know. I mean, I think a different example of this coming out of the chapters that I have on abolition and suffrage is like a Susan B. Anthony, right? So on the one hand, people have tried to praise Susan B. Anthony because she had a black friend, basically, right? So she's friends with Ida B. Wells, and it's like she can't be racist. She and Ida B. Wells were total besties, right? And the story that tends to get told about Susan B. Anthony is that she had this white secretary whom she told to take dictation from Ida B. Wells, and the white secretary refused to take dictation from a black woman. And so Susan B. Anthony fires her, saying, well, if you can't take dictation from Ida B. Wells, who's my dear friend, then, you know, you can't work for me. But then the same Susan B. Anthony engages in these expediency arguments around suffrage, right? And so she basically tells Ida B. Wells, well, yeah, I was very intentional about excluding Frederick Douglass, even though he had been helpful along the way in the early part of the suffrage movement, from attending any events in the South because I didn't want to like stoke the anti-black racism among the Southerners, like as if that needed to be stoked in any kind of way, right? And so basically Susan B. Anthony explains to Ida B. Wells, in the interest of expediency, I was willing to co-sign anti-black racism in order to get buy-in from Southerners, right? And so part of Angela Davis's critique and Bell Hook's critique and my own critique of what's going on with this suffrage, white women suffragists, is that you know, the expediency argument at the end of the day is not really going to move it's not a coalitional argument, right? It's not going to move your project forward. And one of the things that very insightfully Angela Davis points out is for all of the accommodation that white women did in the suffrage movement for anti-black racism, you know, in the South, and that can be everywhere if you take Malcolm X's claim that the South begins at the Canadian border in the United States. But you know, for all of their accommodation of anti-black racism, at the end of the day, the Southern states didn't even support the suffrage the suffrage amendment, right? So it narrowly passes, but it passes without the Southern vote that had been accommodated for all of those years, right? So that I think that's part of the problem. But I brought up that example to say, you know, having black friends does not prevent you from being anti-black racist. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Guys. My question is a selfish question, but I hope other people can get something out of it.
Okay, can I pause you right there? Can I just say, I've never heard a man describe his question as selfish. So at least 2 women have described their questions as selfish, and I've never heard a man say that. Which is not to say we should do what men do, it's just to say it's interesting that we reflect on ourselves as like somehow being selfish by asking a question that we're interested in, which seems okay to me to do. Okay,
Thank you for that. I appreciate
No
it.
problem.
So my question
There you go.
is about the relationship between erasure and mixture in questions of identity. So
Okay.
I work on monsters and monstrosities. So the figures that I'm looking at are often mixtures of different overlapping sites of identity. So lots of mixtures of metaphors of gender, race, ability, animality, sexuality. And so I'm wondering how to navigate the tension between when we're talking about identities as sites of mixture with the trap of erasure. And so one way, I guess we could go back to the mestiza and say, is the mestiza more than the sum of her parts? Or do we need to continue to circulate between the mestiza as more than the sum of the parts, but also the parts in a continuous kind of cycle.
So a couple of things. I would recommend looking at Schuler's analysis of the use of analogies in white feminism, because she's not dealing. I don't think she uses the language of monsters or the monstrous, but one of the things she's taking on is like the cyborg stuff, right? And so she's saying, okay, how is the cyborg functioning? Is that, you know, at the end of the day, there's still a centering of whiteness that's happening, and this kind of putting on of women of color onto this cyborg identity, you know, in a way that's still problematic. So I think that might help you see some of that, or at least it gives you an example of a critique of that might also apply to the project that you're working on. Because she deals with the cyborg, and then there's another example, maybe Paris is burning or something like that is one of the other examples. But I think there's some good resources for critiques that you could be aware of so that you're not duplicating what's being critiqued in these other texts. So I think you're going to get, as far as like mestizaje and the intermixture of identities, I think you might get different responses from different people, right? So there it's important to, again, be attentive to and track how different figures are using that term, because everybody's not necessarily using it in the same way. I found, again, going back to Mariana Ortega's In Between, a really good resource, because she parses out a lot of what's happening with different analyses of like Latina identity and mestizaje and other kinds of things, is along with intermeshedness and multiplicity and intersectionality. So that might be a good starting point, because she does kind of outline different figures and different scholars and how they're taking up these terms in different ways that can be helpful. But as a general kind of suggestion, I think what ends up happening is we just take the easy way out, right? And it's just easier to collapse things, to focus on one thing or another, or to focus on an analogy, as opposed to, you know, it takes more work to kind of really analyze and figure out what's going on with the monstrous when there are all of these different things happening, and yet these things are all happening simultaneously in the real world, right? But I think, again, this is where phenomenology can be helpful. Like, what does it mean to attend to all of those different moving, intermeshed? For Lugones, the word parts doesn't work, but, you know, all of the things that are intermeshed with one another, you know, what does it mean to actually attend to the complexity of all of that? I mean, I think there are examples of people who do it well. I mean, I think, you know, again, I love Octavia Butler. So I think she's someone who, you know, if you read like Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, which are like these kind of dystopic, utopic, futuristic stories, there's a way in which, like, everything is always already interconnected, right? So there's not just an analysis of like the problem of climate change, right, that doesn't account for any like race or gender or sexuality or anything like that. There's not only an analysis of racism that doesn't account for gender. Like, everything is happening together, and you can read the book and follow the book, even though all of those things are, because they all inform one another, right? So these are not distinct oppressions, right? So again, you don't want to collapse. They're not all one oppression, but they are co-constitutive in feeding and empowering and supporting one another. And so this is why, like, the expediency arguments don't work, because you're assuming that if you eliminate the gender oppression, then somehow, or if you eliminate anti-white feminism, then somehow that's going to eliminate all the other systems. But anti-white feminism is just part of this broader system that is also being buttressed by anti-black racism and homophobia and capitalism, right? And so this is why it's important to read women of color scholars, because they're already engaged in this kind of analysis, right? So for somebody like Angela Davis, you know, woman, race, and class, like race, class, gender, sexuality, those things are always coexisting and always simultaneously part of her analysis. You can't just kind of separate out one without also attending to the other, because they're all feeding one another. So I think just looking at the models of how, I mean, again, it can be, it is more challenging. You know, it requires more work and more attentiveness, but I think it's worth it, you know, at the end of the day.
Sort of jumping off of that, you segued into the question I wanted to ask about techniques of domination or oppression. It seems like you've been focusing more on the side of identity here and the oppressed, and I want to ask about the oppressor. You know, I'm a Marxist. I'm not old school vulgar Marxist, but nonetheless, I do tend to think
non-vulgar Marxist.
I do tend to think like capitalism can't explain the nuances of oppression across the board, but on the other hand, for almost any oppression, it won't go away in a systematic way until this deeper issue not deeper in this, but like this sort of economic issue is also dealt with, right? I just wonder what you have to say to that.
So the caution is at the deeper issue part of it, right? So if you you pulled back from it, you were like, oh, I shouldn't say deeper. Yeah. But if you really think like, oh, that is the deeper. So this idea that somehow there is this primary oppression that undergirds all the other oppressions, I think is a losing game, right? Because they're working in operation to one another. So I'll give you a different example. So you can say we can talk about how class is operating across the different categories, but of course you can also talk about how gender is operating across the different categories with class, or how sexuality is operating across. You can pick the different things that are operating simultaneously. A different example that has been brought up for me is not so much class. And I'm dealing with class too because Angela Davis is in there, and she's, of course, takes the class analysis very seriously, right? And this is, again, Women Race and Class is published in 1981. And she's doing this historical analysis of abolition, suffrage, slavery that brings together race, class, gender, sexuality, together. She's thinking all of those things together. But a different example of what's been brought up for me is the issue of age, right? So Penny Deuter has pointed out how Simone de Beauvoir deals with the question of age and the degree to which, how much do I want to engage or not engage the question of age. But then she anticipates my response, which is, okay, even when we fold age into the analysis, and you have Black feminists who've done that, right? Audre Lorde or Oyewumi and other people, it still has to be thought with these other categories, right? So if you're bringing class in, but you're still thinking about white women in class, or the white bourgeois woman in particular, then you're leaving out a lot of other elements. Or if you're bringing in an age and you're thinking about the white middle class woman without an analysis of how differently situated women age, then you're still missing something. So this is why, it's harder but necessary to think all those things together.
Can I? Is it okay?
Sure.
Yeah. So I guess to rephrase and definitely get away from going
from the deeper part,
aspect. I guess I'm thinking sort of the way there's been this criticism of this sort of picture of white woman feminism that sort of fights for more women in the boardroom, right? And so in a way, this has a kind of invocation of universality, but really it just means whoever's privileged enough to get to that point in the first place. And in fact, the millions of other women who are going to remain impoverished are going to remain. So this is one of the things I'm thinking about is there's a peculiar aspect to economic analyses which actually makes me want to resist class-based versions of economic analyses and talk more about mechanisms of domination. But it seems to me that there's a way that if that doesn't get rid of, then the goal itself isn't really met, is all that I was thinking. So maybe more of the issue there is the question of how it's a mechanism of oppression, and less who is the recipient or the what's the word, the beneficial.
The beneficiary.
Yeah.
So I think it's both and. And this is again what women of color scholars tend to do, the both and analysis, right? So it's both the interlocking systems of oppression, it's the white supremacist, heterosexist, capitalist system, et cetera, and the ways in which these systems and mechanisms, produce certain types of identity categories or make certain people, more or less vulnerable within those categories. And so I think part of it is also just letting go of this idea that there is a singular goal, right? And this is where I think the idea of coalitional work is important because, maybe we don't all have the same goal, but where there are some shared goals, how can we work together toward those shared goals? And this is where an Arendtian, even though I'm super critical of Arendt, but an Arendtian kind of notion of power of as men, and we would add women acting together in concert, I think is helpful, right? I think you may have these moments of coalition and power, but this idea that there's going to be just this consistent over space and time coalitional project that results in the revolution that eliminates all systems of oppression is just not going to happen. So the question becomes, how do you, and I want to balance this because I don't want to push this idea that, we always have to be these resistant subjects, because I'm really appreciating like Lindsay Stewart's analysis of cultivating the politics of joy as well. But I think it's letting go of this capital R revolution that somehow is going to eliminate these mechanisms and recognizing that they're constantly reinventing themselves, and how do we find places of coalition to push back when and how we can. Okay, I think I'm going to end it there. I'm getting tired of answering this. Even though we have the room until 9.
You've been down again.